Hi everyone. Just wanted to introduce myself first before we get started. My name is Gawn. I'm a speech and language therapist, and I've been asked by PADS to put together some information or a little bit of a podcast around oral motor skills. So my plan is to talk about what these are and what we can do to help and what we do within our therapy to work on these skills. So hope you enjoy. So the first question we've got to ask is, what are oral motor skills? So obviously, as the term suggests, oral, it's something to do with the mouth and the face, and that's absolutely true. When we're thinking about how we describe oral motor skills, we'd say it's the movements of the structures of the face, of the structures of the mouth. So we're very interested in things like the jaw, the lips, the tongue, but we're also interested in structures that are inside the mouth, like the palate as well. And when we think about oral motor skills, we think about them in a range of different ways. So we think about tone. So what's the tone of these structures? We're also interested in the range of movement, as well as the speed and the coordination. So how do these structures work together? And another important thing that we look at is a thing we call disassociation. So disassociation is where different structures within the mouth can work independently. So when I do a kiss, I can move my lips without necessarily moving the whole of my jaw. So we would call that disassociation. And what we know is that for mature forms of eating and drinking and speaking, that actually that disassociation is really important. The other thing we know about oral motor skills is that when we're born, we don't have them fully developed. These are skills that develop as we learn to eat and drink in different ways, and also as we develop our talk. Why are these skills important when we're thinking about our guys with Down syndrome? So one of the things we know is that for our kids with Down syndrome, it is likely that there is going to be some physical differences when we're looking at those oral structures. So we know there are likely to be some anatomical differences, so the way the structures are actually formed. So let's think about things like the high arched palate. But we also know that there might be some differences in terms of things like function. So there we're thinking around differences in tone. So we know that for our guys that tone is an issue, often low tone. And also what we observe is there may be some differences in terms of things like speed of movement and range of movement. So because of these things, it may be that for our kids, those oral motor skills that we are looking at take longer to develop. We already said that these are skills that we're not born with, they're skills that we develop, but for our guys that may take a little bit longer. The other thing that we may notice is that they don't develop in the typical way. So we might start to see some less typical patterns. So, for example, we might start to see some tongue thrust, or we may start to see some movements. So instead of trying to say with this position, we see it more with that position, and that's less typical. So we know that because of maybe these physical things, there could be some difficulties in developing these oral motor skills as we would normally see. The other thing that we notice is that our guys may have some sensory issues. So they may be slightly undersensitive, hypo, or they may be oversensitive, hypersensitive, and that can have an impact too with their oral motor skills. So that could mean that they can't necessarily feel what's going on. If they're undersensitive, they're not so aware of what's happening with these structures. If they're oversensitive, it could be that they're seeking sensation, so they're looking for sensation, and obviously that's going to have an impact as well. So when we're thinking about these skills, what we recognise is that for our guys, there may be reasons why these don't develop as we would typically expect. And so it's important that we're thinking about that right from early days and thinking about what we can do to support. Starting to think about, well, what can we do? If there are some issues with our motor skills, what can we do? And our first point was thinking about the fact that there may be some issues with sensory, and this is something that we do see quite frequently. So what we're suggesting is that from quite an early age, we start thinking about it and starting to put some practices into place that just make sure that if there are any issues, your baby, your young child is starting to get used to those sensations, and get used to sensory touch around their face, because that's going to support later on. So it's important, as I say, one of them is about getting that used to that, so normalizing those sort of feel and touches around the face. And the other important thing is just getting them aware of what these things are in my face. If we want to start talking about these later in terms of speech, having that awareness is actually really, really important. So the first thing we want to think around is just getting used to touch, and sensation. So we're going to talk in a little bit about what we can do around the face, but do consider thinking about different touch across the whole of the body. So experiences where your baby or your child can feel different textures through their hands, through their feet. It may be that they find it easier to touch things on their hands and their feet before they are able to feel the touch on their face. So you might find if you're trying to introduce, say, a new sponge or a new flannel or something like that, that actually they're quite happy to let you touch it on their hands and their feet before they'll let you touch it on their face. So it's about getting them used to those differences in sensation. So just think about those opportunities, so different places that they can put their hands, different textures that they can feel, just to start thinking around that sensation across the whole of the body. The other thing that we want to think about is the fact that actually for our kids, there are lots of routines around the face, that are actually really important. Keeping their faces clean, keeping their noses clean, wiping their noses. They're all really important parts of the day. And if our guys have got some sensory issues, that can become a real battle for them, for you, and it causes some issues. So thinking about from a really early stage, when you can, starting to establish some routines around that sort of face cleaning and nose wiping. So things where they can get used to the feel of what you're going to use. They get used to the pattern of how you do it and the routine. So it becomes something where there isn't an issue around any of the sensory stuff. They've got used to it, and that just means that those routines that are going to happen every day, multiple times during the day, become less of an issue for you. And when you're thinking about those routines, we would also suggest that you start thinking about the movements you make. So if your child does have some sensory issues, light, gentle touches may not actually be the right thing. They may need you to make really firm touches. So make sure that if you're cleaning their face, they know what's going on. There's a nice firm touch. We know, for example, that swiping, if you're, say your child is at a stage where they're dribbling a bit more, swiping and a sort of more gentle touch can actually increase dribbling and saliva production, whereas a firmer dabbing is going to maybe reduce that a little bit. So it just brings us back to that point when we're thinking about those routines around the face, think about firm movements. The other thing to think about is just other sensations that might happen. So say for example you've got a lovely fluffy sleeve on, a big jumper, and you go into the wipe the face and there's a movement of the sleeve across the face. Actually, that may cause a sensation that your child doesn't like, and it means that routine is disrupted. So it's just thinking about establishing those routines in a way that takes account of maybe any sensory issues that your child might have. For us, if we're starting to think about developing that sensation, supporting any sensory issues around the face, we'd be saying make the most of any opportunity where you can get in and touch the face. So that's part of your general routines. wiping noses, but also, you know, if you've got creams to put on, or if they like particular songs that you make up, just making sure that that touching face just feels really, really normal. For some guys, that might take longer than others, and we generally use what we call the stroke on face song. So we often start this with littlies that we're starting to work with, and that gradually starts to get them used to different touches around their face. And we start from, if needed, away from the face, and then we start from further away, like the head, and start to move into different structures on the face. This song is very easy. It's to the tune of Skip to My Lou, and it works through different structures. So if I sing you the first tune, excuse my voice. So the first verse might be stroke, stroke, stroke your head, stroke, stroke, stroke your head, stroke, stroke, stroke your head together. So you would be stroking your child's head. You'd be doing quite firm touch so they could feel it. And then you move from head to cheeks, and then to patting the chin, and to stretching the nose, and to the lips, stretching the smile, and then to patting the lips. And what you would do, and what we do if we're working with a child, is just take that very gradually. So we start from further away. We notice if they're starting to get a bit upset about it. So if they're pulling away, or things like their eyes are starting to widen, and we stop at that verse. But as they get used to those sensations, we gradually move through the whole of the face. Now, the other important part of that song, as well as them starting to accept sensation, is that also they're starting to learn the names of these structures. So when we're talking about stretch your nose, they can feel this thing we're talking about. When we're talking about pat your lips, they can feel these lips. So later, when we might need to do some talking about that in terms of speech sounds, we can already have a sense that they understand what these structures are. This thing's called my lips, and oh yeah, when I do this, I feel it. So it's bringing about both that sensory, getting used to the touch and the sensation, but also bringing in that awareness as well. Now, we notice for some kids that actually they either seek sensation, so they're looking for things, or they may be slightly undersensitive, and so we may think about introducing what we call buzzy toys. So if we've got a child seeking sensation, so you might find your child, if you happen to have introduced something like an electric toothbrush, they love it. And so they're seeking that sensation, or they're doing lots of chewing. You may also find that your child seems to be less aware of sensation around their face, and we sort of want to wake it up a bit. So we use buzzy toys. I'm going to show you a few. Now, these don't necessarily have to be anything that's specialist. So although there are some that you can buy from sort of specialist centres, so these are called vibe critters, and they're just little critters that you turn them on and they vibrate, and they've got bits on them that the kids can have a feel and a chew. But you've also got, you know, this is a standard back massager from Boots, and that might be the right vibration. The reason I'm showing you these is the fact that everything that's buzzy actually buzzes at slightly different vibrations, and your child may need different vibrations. So if they need something quite strong, you need to find something that actually has got quite a strong vibration to it. But it's just also to say that, you know, you don't necessarily need to go and find specialist things. You might find that there are just some things like, you know, in Boots, a back massager that brings that vibration. So what we would say if you were using these buzzy toys is to have something that you can give to your child that they can put down when they have had enough of that sensation. Okay, so we've had a think around sensory issues and what we could do to support that when we're looking at oral motor skills. So this last section is to have a little think around the skills in themselves and what we can do to start developing them. So we've already said that it may be for our guys that developing our motor skills is something that takes a little bit longer, or that actually some less typical patterns may develop. And we know that because of potentially the differences in anatomy, or maybe issues with tone. So even from an early stage, as well as thinking around the sensory issues, we want to think about what can we do to start supporting the development of these oral motor skills. Now, obviously, one big part of that, we've already talked about the fact that oral motor skills are important for eating and drinking, for feeding, is that as your child is learning to and is developing their eating and drinking, that they will also be developing oral motor skills as well. So what's important when we're thinking about that then is making sure that we're thinking about how we develop those skills further. And for those where there may be some issues around that, then you could be talking to your speech language therapist around how do I move my child's eating and drinking skills on, and how do I start to help them establish those patterns that we want to see, those sort of normal patterns that they would be using to do their eating and drinking. So that's definitely one area we should be looking at to support the development of our child's oral motor skills. The other thing we can start to do is think about it in relation to speech sounds and developing talking. Now, one important point I'd like to make here is that oral motor skills are just part of what's important when we're developing our speech. Developing the use of speech sounds is actually quite complex, and there are lots of reasons why actually using sounds and using sounds in words can be difficult, and can be difficult for our kids with Down syndrome. So when we're thinking about oral motor skills, it's definitely something that's important and we're looking at, but we also recognise it's just one part of that. So if we're thinking from a very early stage, we've already talked around the fact that we want to start building and developing those movements that are going to be important for speech, and building awareness. So particularly when your child is at an age where they're not yet starting to talk, or they're not yet starting to use sounds, if there are things that you can do to help them practice the movements of speech, or those movements that they might use in speech, that would be really important. And also we talked as well about that sort of awareness, getting them aware of what's going on with this. So if we take something as simple as bubbles that you might be doing with your child, let's take awareness first. So I'm hoping my bubbles are going to work. Let's see. Oh, yeah, so I've got a bubble. So even if you were just blowing and your child's loving it and they're enjoying it and you're having a great time together, even just doing something like simply putting it on their lips and it popping will help start to build that awareness. And you can be talking, oh yeah, it was on your lips. You can be starting to talk about it popping. The other thing is obviously once they are getting to an age where they can start to think about it, you might notice that they want to start thinking about blowing it. And that's great, because actually if you think about blowing, the general way we do it is we round our lips and we blow out. Those are both movements that are important within speech for certain sounds. So just doing something as simple as playing with bubbles, you are also starting to think about supporting oral motor skills. Just a little point on blowing. It's actually easier for your child if you catch the bubble if they want to blow it, rather than trying to blow it through the wand. But if your child can blow it from a bubble caught on the wand, and you want to make it a bit harder and they're having to work much harder on rounding their lips, then start to think about, can they blow it through the wand? So just something as simple as bubbles, great fun. There's lots of things you can do with it, but also they can really start to help those early oral motor skills. What you may have also seen is that your therapist, or you might have seen on blogs or things like that, is that people are starting to use tools. So definitely within our therapy, we would be thinking around the use of various tools to support development of oral motor skills. And the reason these tools are fantastic for us is that they work really well with our guys' learning style. So we know that our guys with Down syndrome find it maybe harder to take on board instructions if they're just given verbally. It's not they can't, it just may be harder. And where we can give them opportunities to practice a skill, or for them to be able to feel it or to see it, then that's really beneficial. So if we're thinking about a movement for speech, and let's take blowing for example, and we're giving that verbal instruction, blow, we'll do lots of visual, we'll do lots of showing, those sorts of things. But actually, if we then start to use a tool, there's something to be done, there's a physical action to be done that works with our guys, because actually that may be easier for them to pick up and do than us just giving a verbal instruction. So it really works. The other thing that's great about these tools is that they give you lots of opportunity for repetition. So I'm sure for those of you who've got kids that have started blowing whistles, they're great fun to blow again and again. So you're getting lots of opportunities to repeat those movements that we would see in speech. The other thing is that if we think back to that sensory issue, is that actually what we have with these tools is a physical touch. It really helps our guys understand what needs to happen with their structures, or those structures we need for oral movement. So let me give you an example. I was working with a young man who was struggling to put his lips together for sounds like b, p and m. And actually what we worked out is we didn't think he really understood that that's what he had to do. So we used a tongue depressor between his lips to show him, and just having that tongue depressor helped him feel the fact that these lips had to go together, and that meant that he was much more aware of the fact he had to put his lips together, and we noticed we could then start working on b and p. So these tools are really handy, and what we tend to do in therapy is we look at those movements that may be needed for a sound that your child is struggling with, and we think about what tools we can use to help build up those movements. So the other things that they do is they help us think about the small steps. So if we think about sounds like f and s, that have different things you have to do with your mouth, but one of the things you also have to do is to be able to blow outwards. And if you've got a child who's finding that hard, actually spending some time working on whistles and practicing that blowing out would work towards supporting that blowing out for saying the sounds. But this brings me back to my point at the beginning. These are part of what we do. So we're looking very carefully at where there might be issues. We're noticing the oral motor skills and what they need to do. And if we think that a tool will be useful either to build practice, repetition, awareness, then that's where we'd be introducing it and using it. Definitely with younger children who are not yet starting to speak, introducing some of these are really useful because they start to build those movements that we see. So just like we talked about the bubbles, where you can have opportunities of starting to practice those movements that are going to be important for speech. So like blowing whistles is great because your child is starting to practice those movements. If it becomes an issue later, then we can start to think about how we can build that in to our work on specific speech sounds. So I hope this has been useful. I hope it's given you a sense of what these oral motor skills are, some of the issues that we look at, so whether that's sensory, but also the actual motor skills themselves, and then also some ideas maybe for yourself at the moment where you're at, but thinking very much about those two parts, that sort of sensory part, but also how do we then work on these actual skills specifically.